Somewhere on a road in the Middle East, around 321 BC, a guy is stealing a corpse. Not just any corpse. He's making off with the dead body of Alexander the Great, the most powerful human being who'd ever lived, and he's taking it in the middle of its own funeral. The body's supposed to go home to Greece. This guy has other ideas. He turns the whole convoy around, gold coffin and all, and drives it down into Egypt. That theft is where this story starts. The thief's name is Ptolemy. Get comfortable with it, because for the next 300 years, the person running Egypt is always named Ptolemy, and when it's not a Ptolemy, it's a Cleopatra, or an Arsinoe, or a Berenice. That's the whole list. 15 kings, one name. A dynasty run by guys who never checked if the username was taken. But here's what makes this insane. The Ptolemies weren't Egyptian, not even a little. They were Greek, foreigners. And somehow this one Greek family walked into the oldest civilization on Earth, put on the pharaoh's crown, convinced 30 million Egyptians they were living gods, and held on for 3 centuries. So how do you pull that off? How does a foreign family fake its way into being the god king of a country that isn't even theirs and keep the con running for 300 years? Stealing the corpse was step one. Back up a second, because to get why the corpse mattered, you've got to get how insane the moment was. 323 BC. Alexander the Great dies in Babylon. He's 32. He's conquered basically the entire known world, and he's left zero plan for what happens next. No heir anyone agrees on, no will anyone can read. Just the biggest empire in human history, and a room full of generals slowly realizing that whoever grabs fastest wins. So they grab. Alexander's commanders spend the next few decades tearing his empire apart, and Ptolemy, one of his boyhood friends and personal bodyguards, makes what I'd call the smartest land grab in ancient history. He takes Egypt. Everyone else is fighting over the flashy stuff, the huge cities, the endless plains of Asia, land you can get invaded from on all four sides. Ptolemy looks at Egypt and sees a fortress with a money printer inside. The Nile floods every year and drops free fertilizer on the fields. Food supply runs itself. Desert and sea wall the whole place off, so it's a nightmare to attack. And Egypt had already spent 3,000 years believing its ruler was a god. Ptolemy didn't have to sell anyone on that. It came pre-installed. He just had to become the pharaoh, which is exactly what the stolen body was for. Hold Alexander's corpse. Hold a piece of Alexander's legend. Ptolemy parked that legend in his own capital like a trophy, proof he was the true heir. And in 305 BC, he drops the humble Governor Act, puts on the crown, names himself King Ptolemy I. His nickname of choice? Soter. It means the savior. Subtle guy. So that's how you grab Egypt. Grabbing it was never the hard part. Holding it, that's the part nobody expects to work. Picture Ptolemy's actual situation. He's Greek, speaks Greek, governs in Greek. His whole inner circle is Greek, and he's now in charge of millions of Egyptians who don't speak Greek, don't care about anything Greek, and remember clearly a time when Egypt ran itself and didn't answer to some Macedonian who showed up with Alexander's leftovers. A dumber conqueror forces it, bans the old gods, smashes the old ways, rules at spear point, eats a revolt every 10 years for the trouble. Ptolemy does the opposite. He and his kids pull off a trick I can only describe as running two separate accounts at the same time. In Alexandria, the gleaming new capital on the coast, facing the Greek world, the Ptolemies are Greek kings, Greek statues, Greek poets, Greek everything. But then they'd travel inland to Memphis, the ancient heart of Egypt, and they'd get crowned all over again, full pharaoh mode, Egyptian priests, old temples, the traditional headdress, the ceremonial fake beard. They had themselves carved onto temple walls in the exact frozen pose every pharaoh had used for 3,000 years, handing offerings to gods they didn't grow up with. Look at those carvings and you'd swear these people had never heard of Greece. The historian J.G. Manning literally called his book on them The Last Pharaohs, and that's the whole idea. To the Greeks, they were Greek royalty. To the Egyptians, just the next name on a pharaoh list going back to the dawn of writing, Same family, two costumes, whichever one the room needed. And they went all in. A huge chunk of the gorgeous, postcard-perfect temples still standing in Egypt today was built by the Ptolemies. Sit with how strange that is. A Greek family pouring 3 centuries of cash into Egyptian temples for Egyptian gods, basically to keep proving, forever, that they belonged. That's not devotion. That's the longest, most expensive branding campaign in history. And for a long time, it worked. Looking the part was only half of it. The other half was making Alexandria the single most impressive city on the planet, because nothing says we deserve to be in charge like being richer and smarter than everybody else. So the early Ptolemies built the Library of Alexandria, the ancient world's attempt to collect literally every book that existed, and they weren't gentle about it. The story goes that they'd search ships in the harbor, seize any scrolls on board, copy them, and keep the originals. They wanted the entire written knowledge of the human race, and they'd commit a little piracy to get it. Then, right at the harbor mouth, they built the Lighthouse of Alexandria, the Pharaohs, a tower so massive and so famous it became one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. It stood for over 1,000 years. Picture the flex. You sail toward Egypt, and the first thing you see, miles out at sea, is this impossible glowing tower, telling you the people who run this place are operating on a level you're not. Money, brains, a giant glowing tower, and 2 faces to switch between depending on who's watching. Then the family makes the single weirdest decision in the whole story, the name thing. I told you every king's a Ptolemy and every queen's a Cleopatra or an Arsinoe. Here's why that pool got so brutally small. And it's the part people don't quite believe until you show them the family tree. The Ptolemies kept the bloodline pure by marrying inside the family. Not cousins, siblings, brothers marrying their own sisters. It kicks off with the second king, Ptolemy II, who marries his full sister Arsinoe. Nobody steps in to say anything. It becomes house policy for the next 200 years. The Ptolemies had their excuse ready. They claimed they were honoring old Egyptian tradition, since a few earlier pharaohs had supposedly done the same. That was the cover story. The real reason was money and power. Marry your sister and there's no in-law family to share the throne with. No outside branch that can ever claim a slice of the divine bloodline. The crown, the treasury, the god status, all sealed inside one household. But there's a cost, and it isn't optional. Marry inside the family for generation after generation, and the genetics catch up with you. The later Ptolemies show up in the old descriptions sickly, deformed, and dying young. It's also why the family tree looks less like a tree and more like a knot. Historians have to number them. Ptolemy the 8th, the 9th, the 10th, because otherwise there's no way to keep track of which Ptolemy married which Cleopatra, who was also, depending on the year, his sister, his niece, or both. It really is that tangled. Quick pause. If you've made it this far, you're the kind of person who actually wants to understand how empires rise and fall, not just hear the highlights. So please do me a favor. Hit like and subscribe with the bell on. It's the simplest way to make sure the next story reaches you. Now, back to the fall of a dynasty. Here's the thing about keeping it all in the family. Eventually, the family turns on itself. After about a century and a half, the Ptolemies stop being a dynasty and become a soap opera with an army. Brothers at war with sisters, mothers against sons, uncles murdering nephews for the throne. There's a stretch of over 100 years where they spend more energy fighting each other than running the country. And every time the royal family's busy stabbing itself, Egypt gets weaker. And the Egyptians, the millions of people this whole two-faced act was built to keep quiet, start to notice. In 205 BC, a native Egyptian named Horwenifer declares himself pharaoh in the south and rips a huge chunk of the country out of Ptolemaic control for the better part of 20 years. Here's a detail I love, because you've probably seen this thing without knowing what it is. When the Ptolemies finally crushed one of these revolts, they carved a decree into stone, royal propaganda, written in 3 scripts so everyone in Egypt could read it. That stone is the Rosetta Stone, the most famous archaeological object in the world. For over 1,000 years, Nobody could read ancient Egyptian picture writing until this stone, with the same message in 3 languages, finally cracked the code. And the message it was carrying? A Ptolemaic press release bragging about crushing a rebellion. And there's one more thing quietly wrecking Egypt, and modern science just pinned it down. That same historian, J.G. Manning, led a study in 2017 in the journal Nature Communications. It showed that huge volcanic eruptions, sometimes on the other side of the planet, could throw the weather off badly enough to make the Nile fail to flood. No flood, no harvest, no harvest, and revolts spike. So some of the unrest that helped bring this dynasty down may have been set off by volcanoes the Egyptians never even saw. That's not a legend. That's ice cores and Nile records lining up almost perfectly. So, the family's knifing itself. The locals are rebelling. The harvest keeps failing for reasons nobody on the ground can even see. And that's exactly the smell in the water when the most dangerous predator in the ancient world starts circling. Rome. By now, Rome's the rising superpower of the Mediterranean, and Egypt is the richest grain basket around. To Rome, Egypt isn't a rival. It's a snack they haven't decided when to eat. One moment in 168 BC tells you everything. A foreign king invades Egypt and is about to take Alexandria itself. What saves the Ptolemies isn't their army. It's one Roman ambassador, a man named Popilius Lanus. He walks up to the invading king, hands him a letter from the Roman Senate telling him to get out. And when the king says he'll think about it, the Roman draws a circle in the dirt around the king's feet and says, "Give me your answer before you step out of that circle." The king, one of the most powerful men alive, folds because Rome said so. That's the new reality. Egypt still looks like a kingdom, but it only survives as long as Rome allows it. The Ptolemies aren't players anymore, they're a client, and everyone knows it. Which brings us to the last Ptolemy, and easily the most famous, Cleopatra, the seventh, specifically. There were 6 before her. There's a caricature of her, the seductress, the party queen, the exotic villain who bewitched 2 Roman men into wrecking themselves. That version was written almost entirely by her enemies in Rome, and it pulls off something very convenient for them. It turns a sharp head of state into a pretty problem. Strip the propaganda off, and what's left is arguably the best political mind her family had produced in 200 years. Here's the tell. Remember how, for 300 years, not one Ptolemy bothered to learn Egyptian? 3 centuries of ruling Egypt through a translator. Cleopatra is the one who finally learns it. The writer Plutarch says she spoke around 9 languages, and that she was the first of her whole line who could actually talk to her own subjects directly. After 300 years, the family finally produced someone who fully committed to the role, right as the building caught fire. Cleopatra understood the one truth of her time. Egypt's survival ran entirely through Rome. So she didn't fight Rome, she went to the top of it. First she allies with Julius Caesar, the most powerful man alive, has a son with him. Then Caesar gets assassinated, and she aligns with the next most powerful man, the Roman general Mark Antony. And for a moment, it almost works. Together, Cleopatra and Antony are strong enough to make a real play for the whole Roman world. A washed-up client kingdom, suddenly back in the game. Then it all comes down to one sea battle. 31 BC, a place called Actium, Cleopatra and Antony's fleet against Antony's cold, brilliant young rival, Octavian. And they lose badly. After Actium, it's over. Octavian marches on Egypt. Antony takes his own life. And Cleopatra, rather than get paraded through Rome as a trophy, takes hers too, in 30 BC. The tradition says a venomous snake, though even the Romans weren't sure that's really how she did it. What they were sure of is that when she died, the dynasty died with her. 300 years, 16 kings named Ptolemy, a string of Cleopatras, the library, the lighthouse, the 2 faces, the whole impossible balancing act. All of it ends with one woman and one final decision. And the moment she's gone, Octavian takes Egypt, not even as a normal province. as his personal property. The oldest independent kingdom in the world becomes the private grain farm of a Roman emperor. So, how did one family rule Egypt for 300 years? Quick honesty check first. Because I promised you the real math and not just a clickable number. Depending on whether you count from the day Ptolemy grabbed Egypt or the day he crowned himself king, it's somewhere between 275 and 293 years. Historians round it to nearly 300. So that's what we're doing. But now you know exactly where the number comes from. And the answer isn't one thing. They were the greatest impersonators in history, a Greek family that convinced Egypt they were Egyptian, convinced the Mediterranean they were Greek, bought loyalty with libraries and lighthouses, and kept the power sealed inside the bloodline until the bloodline itself started to break. They squeezed 3 extra centuries out of a country that, by every rule of history, should have thrown them out in a generation. They didn't rule Egypt by being Egyptian. They ruled it by performing Egypt, flawlessly, for 300 years, right up until the audience they'd never really won, and the empire they could never outmuscle finally called time. One last twist worth sitting with. The only reason we can tell you any of this in this much detail is the one thing the Ptolemies were quietly best at: paperwork. Egypt's dry sand preserved tens of thousands of their documents: tax records, private letters, lawsuits, petty complaints, receipts. It makes their 3 centuries some of the best documented in the entire ancient world. A dynasty obsessed with controlling the story ended up leaving us the receipts for its own downfall. If you had fun with this one, you know what to do. Like it, subscribe, turn on that bell, so the next story finds you instead of getting lost forever in the back rooms of the algorithm. Thanks for hanging out. See you in the next one.